This is Later That Same Life. I'm Larry Fedorik, bringing you my weekly podcast, telling stories both of a personal nature and of shared public interest. If you enjoy the podcast, tell a friend.
Season 3, Chapter 9.
Number 9.
Get Back.
Number 9.
Get Back is a recent documentary about the Beatles. Directed by Peter Jackson, it is culled from about 60 hours of never-before-seen footage. Masterfully restored, cut into 3 parts, total watching time about 8 hours. It has been lauded by critics and is certainly a must-see for Beatles fans. I am a Beatles fan, a Beatles baby, if you will. The Beatles appeared right around the time I was looking for my own music. Can't say that the Yeah, Yeah, Yeah spoke to me, but something did, and it spoke to the whole world. They quickly went viral. It's like I've had the Beatles my entire life. I haven't ever rediscovered the Beatles, returned to the Beatles, gone through Beatles phases. No, they were just there the whole time. I've listened and do listen to a lot of music. I have a lot of favorites, different eras, different genres, but always the Beatles. I've owned Beatles music in 4 different audio formats, 3 video formats. Along the way, I've purchased all the remastered anniversary editions. And have I read every book and article about the Fabs? No, but close. Add all that up, and I'm still probably not the world's biggest Beatles fan. That's the impact they had. The Beatles changed the world, and that happened in my lifetime. I always thought that was kind of cool. Oh, I know, a lot has happened in the world these past decades. Advancements in science, medicine, technology, space exploration, quantum leaps, paradigm shifts, and the Beatles. Speaking of which, I always found it interesting that the Beatles label and publishing company, Apple Corps, C-O-R-P-S, Corps, in 1978 sued the Apple Computer Company over copyright infringement. The Beatles settled for an undisclosed amount, later revealed as $80,000. And there was a condition. Apple Computers wouldn't get into the music business, and Apple Corps wouldn't get into the computer game. After all, what could music and computers possibly ever have in common? Deal. Oh, and in the following years, Beatles Apple had to sue Jobs Apple a few more times. Various missteps and breach of contract alleged. And then with iPods and iTunes, eventually, they reached a final deal in 2010. I guess ultimately somebody must have said, hey, we can work it out. 60 years on, a documentary about the Beatles can still create a buzz. Isn't that amazing? Over the years, their songs have been covered approximately 3,000 times. As recently as 2019, Danny Boyle directed a film called Yesterday. The premise being that a young man, an amateur musician, enters a parallel universe where almost everything is the same, except the Beatles and their music never existed. He is about the only one that remembers. He begins singing and playing the songs and taking credit for their creation. I saw it. It was a good movie. A world with no songs by any of the Beatles. Hard to imagine. Let me start by giving you some backstory about this documentary by Peter Jackson. The Beatles, the 4 lads from Liverpool, John, Paul, George, and Ringo, were only around as a unit, a band, for about 10 years. And yes, I know about all the time before, John and the Silver Beatles, and then he meets Paul, and they meet George, Pete Best, Stu Sutcliffe, Hamburg et al. But with the addition of Ringo Starr, that was the band that caught the interest of the Liverpudlians at the now famous Cavern Club. That was 1961. January 1962, Brian Epstein takes them under his management wing. 1963, Love Me Do. February 1964, The Sullivan Show.
The Ed Sullivan Show.
Ladies and gentlemen, The Beatles. The Love Me Do, Please Please Me, She Loves You, Yeah, 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 good times didn't actually last that long. By 1965, they were already singing songs like I'm a Loser and I'm Not What I Appear to Be. Help Me If You Can, I'm Feeling Down. And He's a Real Nowhere Man, making all his nowhere plans for nobody. By 1966, the Revolver album introduced tape loops, backward mastering, and intentional feedback, and in its own way was a dress rehearsal for 1967's Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The Beatles changed the world. That album changed music. It was so thick and layered, it would have been impossible for those four lads to stand up on a stage and recreate any of those songs by themselves. Even on that 1966 U.S. tour, the band's popularity had outgrown most venues. Their last show playing together was August 29th, 1966 at Candlestick Park in San Francisco. Those stage amps were barely enough for an arena, never mind an outdoor sports stadium. The stage sound was plugged in to the park's PA system.
Now batting third and on drums, Ringo Starr.
But even that couldn't be heard over the screaming fans. It was time to hang up the touring Beatle boots and go hide in a studio. Months after that, when they emerged as the Sgt. Pepper's Band, it's like they had followed the advice of the LSD guru of the day, Timothy Leary. Turn on, tune in, and drop out. Only they had kind of done it in reverse. Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever were meant for that Sgt. Pepper album, but released instead as singles, as was Hey Jude. Sometime later, that was meant for another LP. Not that long after Sgt. Pepper's Magical Mystery Tour appeared, it was like a disappointing sequel. And in the summer of '68, the Beatles were ensconced in the studio producing tracks for an album they would call The Beatles, and the rest of the world would call The White Album. So intense were those sessions that in August of 1968, Ringo quit for about 10 days until they all cajoled him back in. That White Album came out in November of 1968. Happy Christmas, and that brings us to January of 1969 and the Get Back documentary that is currently out and streaming. The film actually begins January 2nd, 1969, and the whole thing might be called A Month in the Life. So where did all this film footage come from, this 60 hours? Well, the Beatles had a plan. Record at least one more album together, as just the Beatles, John, Paul, George, Ringo, which, by the way, is the proper manner to refer to them individually. It's the correct order. It sounds the best, and it's chronological. It was John's band, he met Paul, they met George, Ringo a later addition. John, Paul, George, and Ringo. Their plan was that when this album was done and released, they would play one more big show, somewhere, to be determined. And all of this, beginning to end, would also be filmed for a documentary, or a movie, or a TV show, or a TV series, or something. They weren't specific, but, they said, let's film this all. We'll document it. An impromptu recording studio was set up in a larger film studio, where dutifully the Beatles, George Martin, a host of managers, engineers, and film folk reported every day for work. They almost never worked weekends. This is the process we see in the documentary Get Back. The process that fans like me always wondered about. Imagine just being there, watching the process, listening to the Beatles work out songs together. Well, that's what we get to do for almost 8 hours. You know, if the Beatles and Beatle Estates ever wanted to release the full 60 hours of unedited film, I'd probably watch all of that too. As it is, I think Peter Jackson has done a very nice job in cutting it down and letting the footage tell the story. There's no narrator and only a few on-screen graphics to help explain events. About 1 week into that January, George Harrison quits the band. Spoiler alert, he comes back, but eventually the Beatles do break up. Sorry. And speaking of breaking up, it had almost nothing to do with Yoko. For the sake of truth and clarity, Yoko Ono did not break up the Beatles. She is at John's side in almost every frame of this film. And actually, after a while, that prompted Paul to start bringing Linda around. Maureen Starkey and Patty Harrison also appear. Why not? Hey, John is bringing Yoko. He loved her. She, him. She made him happy and more creative. Why would a true Beatles fan dislike Yoko? Hey, I'm not saying I'm a fan of her singing, but otherwise, when it comes to John Lennon and the Beatles, I will always defend Yoko. During all of these sessions, the Beatles decide to move the entire project to the basement studios of their Apple headquarters on Savile Row in London. As we watch, song development seems to move at a snail's pace. Very little appears to be getting done musically. They're goofing around a lot, and by mid-afternoon, the wine and beer comes out. They are working against an album and concert deadline, but that keeps getting pushed back by a day or two. They discuss the concert idea, anything from a huge outdoor venue to maybe even the Queen Mary. They're the Beatles. Anything is possible. Eventually, the rooftop of their Apple building is suggested, and everyone seems to like that idea. During this process, you do hear some songs develop. Most of these would eventually become the Let It Be album, but you also hear vamps of some of their hits from the past, sometimes just old songs they like, and others that would later appear on an album called Abbey Road. The boys decide they really do need just one more musician on stage to make it work. I mean, they can all play each other's instruments fine. You know, if Paul is playing piano, well, John can do bass and George will do rhythm. But really, it would work best if we got one more guy on keyboards. And that's when Billy Preston comes in. His presence alone, for me, is worth watching the film. Over the years, many people have been labeled or laid claim to the title The Fifth Beatle. But Billy Preston is the only one that deserves that. He slips in seamlessly. Those iconic piano sounds in songs like Get Back and Don't Let Me Down that for years we just thought of as Beatles, that's Billy Preston, and we see him working them in. The documentary basically culminates in that rooftop concert, January 30th, 1969. And we get to see some great, what we would call B-roll, of street reactions and other people walking by as the Beatles begin to make a racket in the neighborhood. The Get Back film confirmed for me that history has been a little too kind to George Harrison. It used to be said that Ringo Starr was the charter member of the Frickin' Lucky Club. But the more I watch the four of them work together, the more I think it was George. Obviously, he could play, he could sing a bit, and he wrote some pretty good songs. Not as many as you would think, by the way. On his own, he was pretty good. But in the Beatles, he was up against Lennon and McCartney. In Canadian terms, he was on the same team as Gretzky and Messier. Without his name on the back of the jersey, we wouldn't even know who he is. Nice pass, but you're not the one we came to see play. When Harrison quits the band, John Lennon, in a bit of a snit, can be heard saying, if he's not back by Tuesday, we'll just get Clapton. They later realize, and history also thanks them for this realization, that the Beatles are not John, Paul, Eric, and Ringo. It's John, Paul, George, and Ringo. They were always the four, at the Cavern Club, in the back of the van or the limo between gigs, trapped in the hotel rooms, and on stage for millions and millions of people. It was those four. And the Beatles worked to get him back. Hey, you might remember back in 1976, a fledgling late-night comedy show was trying to find its audience. Saturday Night Live. And their young producer, Lorne Michaels, sat in front of the camera asking if the Beatles would reunite on their show. At the time, there were all kinds of rumors about the Beatles getting back together, and huge sums were kicked around for them to reunite. And then there was SNL and Lorne Michaels.
Please allow me, if I may, to address myself to four very special people. John, Paul, George, and Ringo, the Beatles. Lately, there have been a lot of rumors to the effect that the four of you might be getting back together. But it's also been said that no one has yet to come up with enough money to satisfy you. Well, if it's money you want, there's no problem here. The National Broadcasting Company has authorized me to offer you a certified check for $3,000. Now here it is, as you can see, verifiably, it is a check made out to you, the Beatles, for $3,000.
I always love the story that Paul and John were together watching SNL at John's apartment in New York City, just blocks from NBC. And they thought for a laugh they should just grab a cab and go visit the live program just to freak them out. That would have been great. Never happened. As a matter of fact, after that weekend, John and Paul never saw each other in person again. As the story goes, Paul showed up at John's place again on the Sunday and was turned away at the door, Lennon allegedly saying, "Hey, it's not 1956, meaning that we're not just the kids in Liverpool 20 years ago popping in and out of each other's houses unannounced. I choose to remember the night before, and that they were on good terms." George Harrison did guest on Saturday Night Live not too long after, and raised the issue of the $3,000. And Lauren had to explain to him that the $3,000 was for all four of them, and at best maybe George could get $750.
Well, I mean, I tell you one thing, you want to get it straight in the future. You know, when you go around
but I mean, I thought that you would understand that if it was, $3,000 for four people, then it would just be $750 for them. As far as I'm concerned, I mean, you could have the full $3,000. It's the network.
Pretty chintzy.
You know, if it were up to me, I'd give you the $3,000, but I got the network. Hilarious. Kudos to George Harrison for appearing in that skit. But if we remember, one of the first things we loved about the Beatles was their sense of humor. Yeah, the Beatles had to be the four of them, not just to SNL, but to all of us. No other parts or combination would do. I've seen McCartney live. On TV, I've seen Ringo play with McCartney. I've seen Lennon shows. Watched combinations of them being interviewed together. They are Beatles, but it's never the Beatles without all four. They are unique in that. I mean, Jagger and Richards, okay, you're the Rolling Stones. Townsend and Daltrey are the Who. We assume that's Pearl Jam because we hear Eddie Vedder singing, so okay, good enough. But the Beatles, John, Paul, George, and Ringo. And not any of their offspring filling in. I actually saw Julian Lennon and his band play live once. He did a Beatles song where his father would have sung lead. He and the band sounded just like the Beatles record. It was amazing. But again, not the Beatles. Once I was in a small press conference room with Paul McCartney. We were wearing almost the identical jacket. And when he came in the room, he noticed and kind of smiled and nodded at me. These are all near Beatle experiences that I file into my memory bank. The Get Back documentary, kind of in that same category. Except this time, it was all of them. I was once removed because of the electronic transmission through a screen, but still pretty awesome. I never cared that the Beatles changed. You've changed, man. It's not the same. As a matter of fact, I loved that they grew and evolved. But it was the spirit of those early mop tops. That's what I wanted to remember. In Get Back, and I know that this was a select 8 hours of 60 total hours of film, but we see 4 guys in a band making music. John and Paul feeding off each other, laughing, carrying on, doing voices, making faces. And though technically not writing songs together, it is a McCartney song that wouldn't be as good if John wasn't there working it out with him. And the opposite also true. 2 distinct talents and personalities who by some miracle got together. Just look at their legacy songs. Paul McCartney, I Believe in Yesterday. John Lennon, Imagining a Future. There's your differences right there. The Beatles met Billy Preston in the Hamburg days. Billy was playing for Little Richard. It's one of the reasons the rooftop concert was so cool. Back to the roots, the last Beatles live show, just the lads, and playing like the tight rock and roll band we first heard, before all the fame and the production and the experimentation. Just play. It has been said that for a decade, the 2 best singers in all of rock and roll were in the same band. There's a Beatles trivia question about what was the last Beatles album. By release, it was, of course, Let It Be. But after those January 1969 sessions, the Beatles went on to record material for Abbey Road. That came out in the fall of '69. Let It Be came out in 1970. But all of those songs would have been from those January 1969 sessions before they recorded Abbey Road. Abbey Road would have been the last album the Beatles recorded. There's a little fun Beatles trivia to impress your friends at parties.
Come tend the garden with me. We have so many seeds to sow. When the harvest comes in, it will be time to share what we have grown. We were having the time of our lives when we started. Everything was groovy.
The amount of audio recorded over those days was massive. The Beatles did break up and started their own individual projects. And really, nobody wanted to attack this big job, the January Project. Eventually, the Beatles handed all the tapes over to Phil Spector. He added his touch, some strings, et al., and that's the album that most Beatle fans know today as Let It Be. If I may recommend an album called Let It Be Naked, a McCartney and Apple Corps sanctioned project where they took all those tapes and remixed them more in the way that McCartney had heard the album in his head all those years ago. As a Let It Be album, I actually prefer it. I ended up believing that Phil Spector should have been thrown in jail years ago for murdering Beatles music. This version, Let It Be Naked, is much better. And if you see the Get Back film, you'll especially want to give it a listen. I kind of wish Disney didn't stick its nose into my nostalgia, but the legal way to see this film is on Disney+. I subscribed to it just to see this. $11.99. Who can afford all these streaming services? But it's the Beatles. For me, I look at it that I would have paid $11.99 to go see a Beatles movie in a theater, and this one's 8 hours. And for that price, I can watch it again and again, which I have. By the way, nostalgia? A great place to visit, but I wouldn't want to live there.
Later That Same Life is written, voiced, and produced by Larry Fedoruk. LarryFedoruk37@gmail.com. Subscribe to Larry's podcast YouTube channel. Get automatic notifications with each new episode.